Coming up, the New York Football Giants offseason rolls on, and Malik Nabers has all the wide receiver one stink dripping off him as we work our way towards training camp. Why he was the perfect pick for Big Blue, and also how Jalen Hyatt just might be ready to step up into that number 2 role. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Marmrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, we're back from an impromptu week vacation effectively for the show. Why? Because it happens. It's hot out there, Andrew, and sometimes you got to keep cool. We're going to talk about Malik Nabers, we're going to talk about the wide receiver room, but how are we, sir, as we tap in on a Tuesday?
Listen, I'm a little groggy still from the weekend. There's still some effects that are lingering. I met up with my college roommate, had a golf tournament, obviously, some late nights, some groggy mornings. But hey, I'm a trooper. We're here. It's the dog days of summer, but we're still here, Adam, kicking.
Pros pro, as we like to say. Also, if you didn't watch it live last night, we talked about Darren Waller. We talked about his retirement, obviously, the opening that it leaves in that tight end room, and all the aspects of that. So you can go check it out on YouTube or on the podcast feed to get reconnected with that as we gear ourselves up going towards training camp. But Malik Nabers, my good friends, is doing everything that you could want him to do in camp. How willing are you, Andy, to drink the Kool-Aid, to buy into the hype, and to start to take that look, even just on an individual level with Malik Nabers, and say, like, okay, like we're talking about a guy that was worthy of the 6th overall pick and that's ready to really hit the ground running from a number 1 wide receiver standpoint, because that's always the variable here, which would be fine, but we'd prefer if he kind of became a number 1 immediately.
Well, I mean, Adam, listen, everything you're hearing and more importantly, everything you're seeing, right? The videos that the Giants are releasing with the way that he's making grabs, the way he can, contort his body to be able to catch balls that you're like, how is he even close to that? He is just an intriguing guy. I mean, listen, as we mentioned before, in our pecking order and priority list during the draft, we kind of thought Rome Odunze fit what the Giants wanted to do a little bit better. However, you're seeing the reason why the Giants drafted him. It's because there's no player in this draft that is more explosive than Malik Nabers. And that goes for Caleb Williams. It goes to everyone else. He has this upside pop that very few players have coming into the league. And when you see it, you hear everyone talking about it. You're hearing, other rival assistant GMs are kind of saying he's going to be a problem. Like he might be better than Odell Beckham Jr. That's not, us even putting that out in the ether. Other teams are already saying that's how much we have to game plan for him early on. And listen, what else could you want to see, Adam, during the spring than Malik Nabers being the freakish athlete, adding explosiveness to an offense that frankly really needs some explosive playmakers?
You better believe it, man. And we talked about projections on the field and what that's going to look like. We'll go deeper into fantasy numbers as we get towards the season and players that might be worth it. We obviously always have Andy's bets of the week and where you want to lay down a couple of shekels. But when you talk about 2024 PPR wide receiver rankings, Andy, where do you think Malik Nabers currently stacks up there in the hierarchy of wide receivers around this NFL football league?
I'm going to go 22.
Hey, that's because he's a classy guy and he believes in putting stock in these young men. Now, it does deflate it a little bit because he's 28th, but that's neither here nor there. It's still a top 30, which I think is noteworthy. He falls into the range here, by the way. You're talking about just behind players like T. Higgins, like Calvin Ridley, a player who's had his own problems here, and Rashee Rice, Zay Flowers, just ahead of him inside of this group. I find the Zay Flowers to be a really interesting one and potentially noteworthy to watch. Right ahead of Tank Dell, Keenan Allen, George Pickens, Chris Godwin, DeAndre Hopkins, Amari Cooper, Christian Kirk. Players that either are maybe veterans and starting to take, that modest step back away from some of the elite numbers, or players that were supposed to be. Christian Kirk jumps out with the money that he's made over the last handful of seasons. The fact that, listen, any number 1 wideout needs to be pretty close to the top of the pecking order, but it does feel like camp, and again, that's OTAs, camp to me, training camp to me, is going to be where we start to plant our flag here, and it's going to come down to route running, where you see him lining up, and even though we don't want to see the secondary get abused, maybe how much of a lashing that he can put on no matter who the Giants and the defensive front say, hey, let's try Banks, let's try safety help over the top. When you see some of the plays that he's making in camp, that's what gets you excited, because that's the value. You mentioned Odell Beckham, of a number one wide receiver, that it's less about, oh, is he covered? What are they doing defensively? And just, I put the ball out to him. He goes and makes the play. We know the New York Giants have not had that talent consistently, arguably since OBJ.
Yeah, and the thing is, Adam, when you think about last year's team to this year's team, when you have Darren Waller, who was healthy, then he's out.
Yep.
Obviously, he's now retired. You had Saquon Barkley, which was our best playmaker on the offensive side of the ball. He's no longer with us. But really, this is going to be a completely different dynamic for this offense. It was run the ball, minimize mistakes, try to do our best to ground and pound, and try to just stay in games. If the offensive line is better and gives more time for Daniel Jones to be able to throw the ball, or blocks better so that in the backfield, Devin Singletary can maybe get a couple of positive yards instead of the 2nd and 12s and 3rd and 13s when Saquon's making home run plays, we could see the Giants offense transform in one offseason. It's no longer, oh, we got to do this multiple times, or we have to wait till the next quarterback comes in. There is the possibility that this offense could be dynamic, especially if teams see how explosive Malik Nabers is and they now have to game plan for him. They were game planning for Saquon Barkley, saying just keep him in front of us and we're fine. How do they do that when the offensive line is better, giving Daniel Jones more time, more weapons on the outside?
Yeah, consistency. That's what matters most. And even though you mentioned Saquon Barkley, he made some impressive plays in the receiving game over the years. Maybe most notably, was it back then when it was an OBJ to Saquon down the right sideline, right? And that was just kind of this amazing moment of watching those two players and those two talents. Then, of course, for New York Football Giants fans, a big play like that didn't involve a quarterback. But nevertheless, that getting away from that, there's a difference between having your elite talent be a running back and having your elite number one talent be a wide receiver. And that's what I want to get to next year. We're also going to talk about Jalen Hyatt and what maybe he needs to do and what the opportunity is for him to help this offense overall become explosive. But coming up here in a second, why having a wide receiver one is so much more critical than what the Giants have had, an RB1 even behind now an improved offensive line. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment. As we continue the One Giant podcast, we remind you today's episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. That spells Pietential, an online free assessment tool for individual users. It sets a mark for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and tracks that progress as well. It's a great opportunity. Let's say you're a rookie in the NFL, like Malik Nabers, man. Get in there, say, how do I want to play? What do I want to bring from an attitude standpoint, which we're going to talk about too here today? And how do I carry it forward so I become a leader for the New York Football Giants? He can start over on Pietential, and so can you. Before we talk about his attitude, his approach, what the Giants organizationally love about him and why they took him at 6, that note about running back, we're using Saquon Barkley, but versus having that elite wide receiver. Listen, staying on time, down, and distance, having the running back matters. But even now, as the offensive line is getting better, we think, and it's going to be more improved, the ability to have players have a number one wide receiver, go on the deep route combinations, line up across the formation everywhere, and force the defense to acknowledge and change with that, changes what you do against Devin Singletary, the running back we talked about, not comparing him to Saquon, but saying how his life can get easier with improved line play and improved wide receiver play as well.
I mean, Adam, look at the contracts that were given out this offseason to wide receivers, right? Guys like Justin Jefferson are getting mightily compensated for the work that they do. Guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown get compensated. Even Michael Pittman Jr., who was available, is going for $25 million. There has been a boom in the wide receiving market, and it's because of the explosive plays that you mentioned before. For Saquon Barkley to impact the game the way that we needed him to, with everyone injured and not having playmakers on the outside, it had to be a Herculean effort because he had to basically overcome a bad offensive line, overcome a wide receiver room that was pretty stagnant, and try to figure out how to break off these explosive plays. Now with Malik Nabers, you have a guy that can literally get behind a defense at any moment. It's why Tyreek Hill is so dangerous. It's why Tua Tagovailoa looks like he's a top half type of quarterback. If you remove him from the equation, the one year that Tua did not have Tyreek Hill, everyone said, did they make the right choice? Is he a starting caliber quarterback? Now they're talking about potentially paying him $50 million. Having Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill on the outside certainly helps you. So from a Giants perspective, it is massive the amount of attention Malik Nabers is going to get. We know that, full stop. But I think what's important is with that attention means that there's less attention or less ability to take care of the other players on the field. And that's really where you're going to have to see the leap. I'm confident that Malik Nabers is going to make a huge impact. Yeah. It's the secondary type of the second option, second weapons, and maybe you have a few different names of who you're thinking about. But with that attention going to Malik Nabers, they have to be able to take advantage of that on the other side or in the slot or in the tight end room.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously, we know you lose a tight end like that, it means that you've lost something productive there. You know, it's funny. I think I made mention of it talking about Darren Waller previously. It's like, hey, go look at how productive he was when he was available. So it's easy to look at it and say when he was injured. And I did that as well. It's why I thought retirement for him or a parting of ways was going to ultimately be the way things went for a variety of different reasons. You still do lose that production. So when you look at Malik Nabers being established, or, you know, we presume coming in and establishing himself early, I do go to, I've already said that I think Wan'Dale Robinson is going to have a very strong season, and people I think maybe are still overlooking him because the yardage isn't as sexy going back to last season, but he's very consistent in terms of turning targets into catches. Jalen Hyatt, to me, who's also been receiving praise in terms of his focus, and most importantly, Daboll mentioned it, his improvement in route running and combinations and where he needs to be on the field. That was, as we all learned, the reason why he fell so much in the draft. He was a number one, first round, graded prospect. He fell all the way to the third because it was, do we know that he can develop in key areas like route tree combinations quickly enough to be an impact enough when you have big money going around for wide receivers? So if it's year 4, by the time you think Jalen Hyatt's ready, you go, okay, now we're turning around, getting ready to pay this kid. Instead, I think he's the guy to watch here, because it looks like he's starting to take those steps forward. He's already said a lot of things, like he believes with the talent we have on this team, we're a playoff team. Now it's about going out and doing it. Where is your confidence level on him? Because there's even some stats from a fantasy perspective, but just from a numbers perspective, where it looks like the footprint for how good Jalen Hyatt and how improved he can be this year is already set. It's a matter of him being ready to do it.
I struggle with this, Adam, because when you look at what people are projecting the Giants offense to be, they say that they have one of the least talented offenses in all of the NFL, right?
Sure.
You look at Daniel Jones, obviously there's questions about what is his health going to look like? Yeah. Is he going to be able to throw for more than 3,000 yards in this season? Is he going to have more than 25 touchdown passes? If we don't think that they are going to open up the offense, there's only so many catches and yards that players are going to have available to them. And that may sound very simplistic, but if you feel like Malik Nabers is going to get, I don't know, we talked about it on our pre-show. He looks like he is every bit of 1,000-yard wide receiver in this league. Right. Maybe he gets 70 catches, 80 catches. You mentioned Wan'Dale Robinson, going to be one of those possession guys in the slot. How many catches is he going to get? How many yards is he going to get? If Wan'Dale Robinson's good for, I don't know, 700, Malik Nabers is good for 1,000, you all of a sudden start running out of players that can have a lot more yards in the pass catching game. And so I kind of wonder if Jalen Hyatt's going to get lost in this shuffle, knowing that they're going to want to feed Malik Nabers, knowing that the security blanket is Wan'Dale Robinson. How does Jalen Hyatt really assert himself to be either the 1 or the 1A in that offense?
Yeah, the interesting thing for me is when you go and look, so going back to Jalen Hyatt last season, and by the way, it's like it's the right thing to point out here. The pecking order, if we believe Malik Nabers is going to come in and establish himself, guess what? He's the number 1 mouth that needs to get fed, right? That's what Daniel Jones, hopefully healthy, needs to do every single time. What's our pre-snap setup? And by the way, that's about also Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka. How are we scheming? Let's create the opportunities. He's the most dynamic playmaker, but including Wan'Dale Robinson in the slot, what I found interesting is you're talking about Malik Nabers, who the opportunity in air yards, Jalen Hyatt, opportunity for air yards last season was 841. Opportunity for yards. He had 18 deep targets, and he only, and we understand the volume that he was operating with. He had just 40 targets, so almost 50% of his targets were looking to be down the field. Average depth of target was 21 yards downfield. So my strongest case that I can make, tentatively, because we all understand what we're coming into here, is that if you give him 65 targets and you give him 35 deep looks out of those 60 targets, and he's ready to convert a bit more because it's not just straight line action. Let's see if you can get over the top, but about these different combinations and maybe getting him onto plus matchups. I can squint and say, yeah, he's going to be a bit boom or bust here, but those booms are going to be significant and maybe more in the role of what we had Darius Slayton fill more often than not a year ago. Bigger receiver, a little more physical. Maybe Jalen Hyatt just has the skill set and the speed to go do that for us on a more consistent basis.
So I think you and I are in agreement that we think that the most production will come from Malik Nabers, or that is the expectation of where the production will
Damn
come.
well better.
You hope you hope with the sixth pick when you pick a guy like this that's that explosive.
If we turn around and Malik Nabers is like third in total yardage on this team midway through the season, something has probably gone off the rails, and we hope it's nothing to do with the players and the health and the ability to be productive.
Right. And so if we kind of move Malik Nabers to the side, my question for you is, Adam, is how do you see the pecking order of production from the remaining wide receivers? If you had to say who is going to produce the most out of Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, and Darius Slayton, and you can go down to our number 3 with a Bryce Ford Wheaton or Allen Robinson if you want. Yeah. How do you see the pecking order? But maybe the better question to you is, what is the ideal pecking order for the Giants?
Oh, that is good. Yeah, that probably is the way we should look at it, right? So remember that a year ago, and we all understand the quarterback room was a mess, and there's probably going to be a higher volume. 485 targets were dispersed through the air. Now, that also includes the tight end position, where 74 went to Darren Waller, 60 of them went to Saquon Barkley. So I think there's already going to be a shift in that regard. So, you talk about having 134 targets, between those two players. I think those are going to be more geared towards the wide receiver room, not in totality, but you're going to get some back there. Right now, as it stands, you talk about Slayton had 79 targets. You had Wan'Dale Robinson with 78, and then you had Jalen Hyatt with 40. So, the Isaiah Hodgins and the Paris Campbells and the Shepherds of the world that all add up to another 80 targets here. I think those, again, get funneled back in. I said this when we talked about Malik Nabers initially. This guy needs to be seeing 100 and to 120 targets over the course of the season if you want the production to be there. I think Darius Slayton's numbers come down in terms of his targets. If he wants to be productive, he needs to do it like he did a year ago. 50 targets, 55 targets. Show me that you can still get 35, 40 receptions, and show me that 15 to 18 yards per clip can still be there. He's a fascinating one to watch. I believe in Wan'Dale Robinson. I don't think those numbers are going to get crazy bigger for him at 78. So really what it comes down to is the bulk of the Darren Waller, Saquon Barkley numbers get funneled to Malik Nabers first and foremost. And then I think it's Jalen Hyatt. So my pecking order probably, and this isn't about wins and losses, this is about building this team the right way. It needs to go in the wide receiver room. Malik Nabers number 1. I'll still put Wan'Dale Robinson number 2 with a slight bump. And then I think it's Jalen Hyatt right there. He needs to go from 40 targets to probably 65 to 70 this upcoming season.
It's funny because you were thinking about success one way. I was thinking about it in a different way because we didn't define it's who's going to have the most yards, right? Or who's going to have the most catches. It's like who's just going to be the most productive or the most valuable.
Yeah.
It's kind of relative because, Adam, if I told you at the end of the year that Jalen Hyatt led the team in touchdown receptions, that would actually not be a terrible thing. You'd say, well, if half of his targets are downfield, that means the Giants are stretching things vertically. That means we had a lot of explosive plays. I think there's a world where the Giants would say, if Jalen Hyatt leads in touchdowns, Wan'Dale Robinson leads in receptions, and Malik Nabers leads in yards, then this offense actually is probably the most explosive it could be, right? Like, I don't know if you're thinking of production that way. It's multifaceted where we expect Wan'Dale to be that possession guy over the middle. We want Malik Nabers to be the workhorse. Jalen Hyatt needs to be the vertical deep threat that if he has eight touchdowns on the season, like that would be huge for the way that we think this offense could operate.
And oddly enough, and I think that's a really good way to frame this. The idea of, well, where is the most production going to come from here, right? And how is it going to result itself? Yardage, receptions, touchdowns. Oddly enough, so the funny thing about Jalen Hyatt, not funny thing, but interesting thing, had 0 red zone targets last year. 40 targets, 23 receptions, 0 in the red zone. So to your point about carving out these roles for themselves, how is that going to come to fruition on the field? And maybe there is the world where a player like Jalen Hyatt finds that quote unquote kind of forgotten role for, forgotten man role for himself when you get down into the red zone. You're going to be worried about Nabers. I think the shiftiness of a Wan'Dale Robinson is going to come into play. And I think we're still going to talk about, as we did previously, the running back rooms and some of the supporting cast that can also be threats there as well, let alone Theo Johnson, let alone Daniel Bellinger, right? How do you want to be productive there with them as well? The other thing here for me, when we talk about this hierarchy, is I mentioned there, Jalen Hyatt, 840 air yards, opportunity-wise. You know what the opportunity was for Darius Slayton last season through the air?
Hit me with it.
960 yards. So a player who was still learning route combinations only received 40 targets. Darius Slayton, who, again, I'm not even knocking the guy. We talked about him. He needed to get paid. You're talking about a player who, on half the volume of what Darius Slayton was receiving in terms of target share, was only 100 yards in potential yardage a year ago. Like, that to me is fascinating. How you move that production is going to be fascinating. 80% snap share for Darius Slayton a year ago. When you look over to Jalen Hyatt's numbers, you're talking about 51%. You talk about slot snaps for Jalen Hyatt, 56%, right? So 56 of those, route runs out of 385. All of these things, numbers getting in the weeds, as I like to do sometimes, all these numbers, though, speak to, if Jalen Hyatt has progressed on route running, you can easily sit here, as he well should, and say he should be able to be as productive from a, let's say, touchdown or a yardage standpoint as Darius Slayton is able to be in previous years, because he's just a better quality player, right? He profiles better, the skill set is better, and because you have now Malik Nabers standing over top of him. I wanted to take one quick look here as well, and then I'll let you run wild with it. Darius Slayton, deep targets. Boom, Andy. I told you that Jalen Hyatt had 18 deep targets a year ago. How many did Darius Slayton have?
6.
17, but I like where your head was at. He had fewer deep targets than Jalen Hyatt. And by the way, I didn't run over any of these numbers with Andy ahead of time, so please, no judgments for my co-host. I'm bombarding him. But the point is, like, I like Darius Slayton, so this isn't a knock on him, but it's just the reality of when he was your number one, you didn't have a real serious weapon, Wan'Dale Robinson and all that I like about him, Jalen Hyatt not being ready yet. You start to reset this. Jalen Hyatt, you can see the footprint there of what they want him to do on a consistent basis, and you start to expand that volume a little bit and give him 30 more targets this upcoming season, maybe more. I think the production has a real opportunity to explode in a great way for him and for this offense.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'm also curious about is losing Darren Waller. Obviously, the
Yeah.
Giants wanted to make the tight end room a focal point. While he was healthy, he was leading in receptions. At one point, he was leading in yards for tight ends before, obviously, his injuries kind of crept back up on him. The Giants went and knew that this was going to be a possibility,
Yeah.
and they obviously went and got Theo Johnson as a result of that. We know he's a big, tall, very, very athletic player. They're bringing back Daniel Bellinger, who had 25 catches last season, playing kind of the backup role to Darren Waller, had 30 receptions the year before that.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be fascinating to see how they split up all of these targets at him, because I wonder how they're going to distribute the ball to these different playmakers, just knowing that the Giants, even in the last couple of years, haven't really aired the ball out or haven't put the ball in Daniel Jones's hands as often as maybe everyone would like. So where are the targets going to be? Is Daniel Bellinger going to get more than 25 receptions? Is he going to be a 1-to-1A to Theo Johnson? Is Theo Johnson going to get one catch a game? Like, where are these receptions coming from? I'm really curious to see how Brian Daboll kind of draws up the scheme and thinks about how he wants to leverage the 2 tight end sets versus the 3 wide receiver sets, things like that. I'm fascinated because right now it feels like if you told me that Daniel Bellinger had 50 catches, I'd believe you. If you told me he had 25 catches again, I could believe you the same way, because I just don't know how they're thinking about scheming those particular tight ends to replace some of the production that just left.
At the end of the day, Joe Shane has brought in a first round, a second round, and a third round wide receiver in all of these drafts now. That's the core of this room going forward. And I believe me, we're going to have a whole other episode about the tight end group and how that reactivates and how that fits into this scheme, because it is critical. But that's why I go back to Jalen Hyatt after Malik Nabers being so important. And at the end of the day, I'll give you this one last stat here between Darius Slayton and Jalen Hyatt, not because it's 1-to-1, but how about this, man? Jalen Hyatt had just 48 yards after the catch, 1.2 per target, and 516 unrealized air yards. 48 yards after the catch. Darius Slayton, 298 on a bigger volume, but almost 500 and unrealized as well. On the one side of it, you could look and say, oh, that's because Jalen Hyatt didn't XYZ. The other way you look at it is once you get this full route tree going for him, you're going to put him into position to have that yak be such a bigger part of how he's productive. We saw some of those flashy moments a year ago in a small sample size. So listen, it doesn't speak to what I think this team is going to do this upcoming season and starting to set a Jalen Hyatt type mark of making the playoffs, but it does get me excited about a young core of receivers, specifically now behind an elite talent like Malik Nabers saying, hey, we can be productive on a game over game situation. It's just about putting those pieces together, and that's what's going to make training camp really exciting.
As you mentioned, at the end of the day, simple answer for you. I'm calling my shot right now. Jalen Hyatt will score his first touchdown next season for the New York Giants. I'm going really far out on a limb, Adam, but hopefully those yards after reception are going to be the reason for it.
Over under 0.5 touchdowns for Jalen Hyatt. We're going to talk so much more about that as we get towards the season. There's a lot of fun narratives there and a lot of good times to have. So the way to be a part of that is get over to YouTube at One Giant Podcast. Go over to X at One Giant Podcast, also at AndyMac214 and at Adam Armbrecht. Some other big news will continue to unfold here over the course of the offseason. But man, be a part of the ride. Have a lot of fun with us. Go check out Potential if you haven't already. And until next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.